Hey everyone, and welcome. Buckle up because today we are taking a deep dive into a horror franchise that just keeps on going. That's right, we're talking Wrong Turn. And we're really going deep. You guys have sent us a ton of articles, think pieces, the whole deal. So we're going to unpack not just the movies themselves, but what makes this franchise tick.
It's funny, when you think slasher, you think masked killer, but Wrong Turn, and this comes up a lot in the articles, they tap into something more primal.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first you've got that setting, those backwoods, that sense of isolation.
Yeah, and the source material talks about how Wrong Turn, especially the early ones, they use that setting, those West Virginia woods, almost like a character.
Totally. It's that classic horror trope.
Yeah.
Make one wrong turn, you're miles from help, and then boom.
You're not alone. And it's not ghosts or aliens or whatever, it's other humans, which, honestly, that's scarier.
Way scarier. And the articles really dig into this idea of monsters among us, which those wrong turn villains, they embody that.
Big time. And you've got those grotesque features, that whole deformed thing going on. Pure nightmare fuel.
It's like a car crash. You know you shouldn't stare, but you can't look away. And that plays right into our deepest fears, the stuff lurking just beyond the familiar.
Exactly. And several articles point out how effective the early films were at building that sense of dread.
But then there's the flip side. You've got your victims, your characters, and, well, let's just say Wrong Turn isn't exactly known for its Oscar-worthy acting.
Right. The articles definitely call that out. You've got your stock characters, the jock, the final girl, the drill.
And sometimes that works. Like, it's part of the fun, right? But as some of these articles argue, it's when a franchise relies too much on those tropes, it gets predictable.
Exactly. And that's where I think Wrong Turn, especially as the sequels piled up, they fell into that trap.
It's like the first time you eat a reheated casserole, it's still okay, but by the third time, you're like, yeah, no thanks, and that's sequelitis for you.
And the articles break down exactly how that happens. You're trying to recapture that initial spark, but it becomes more of the same, even if it means sacrificing logic or, well, originality.
Totally. I mean, some of those later plots, and I'm looking at you, Wrong Turn 4, they just went off the rails, right?
And the special effects, don't even get me started. It's like the budget went out the window along with the plot.
It's true, though. Some fans love that they want that familiar, predictable horror, but when even the gore starts to feel repetitive,
You've gone too far. And that's a key point some of the articles bring up. At what point does more stop being scarier and just become, well,
ridiculous. And maybe that's what we need to unpack next, how Wrong Turn walks that line between effective horror and, well, something else entirely.
Absolutely, because there's a fine line between giving the audience what they crave and just giving them too much.
So we're talking about that line between good horror, effective horror, and then just going too far in Wrong Turn. They definitely like to push those boundaries.
Yeah, no kidding. And the articles bring up a really good point. At what point do even the diehard fans say enough is enough?
Right, like, I can handle a good jump scare, some blood and guts, but when it gets to the point where it's just gross out for the sake of being gross out.
Exactly. And the source material actually analyzes this, looking at how the use of gore in the Wrong Turn films, it kind of evolves over time.
Yeah, and not always in a good way. I mean, I remember watching Wrong Turn 6 with one eye open. Some of those scenes were just brutal.
And the question is, and this is something the articles grapple with, when does the gore stop being effective and just become gratuitous?
Okay, so for example, there's this one scene, I think it was in Wrong Turn 5, where they use, oh man, I can't even describe it, it's too messed up.
Yeah, and that seems to be a pattern. It's like they're trying to one-up themselves with each kill, but in the process, it loses something.
Totally. Like a little bit of gore, strategically placed, it can make a scene terrifying, but when everything is over the top, it just becomes numbing.
It's like sensory overload, and this is something one of the articles mentions, specifically when you're constantly bombarded with gruesome imagery, it loses its power to shock.
And isn't that the point of horror? To shock us, to tap into those primal fears.
Right, but as the source material points out, Wrong Turn, especially in those later films, it gets caught up in this cycle of escalation.
More blood, more guts, crazier kills.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the way, the real horror, the psychological tension, it kind of gets left behind.
It's a common trap for horror franchises. They stumble onto a successful formula, but then they're afraid to deviate from it.
It's like they're stuck in the same terrifying loop, and that's where things can get, well, a little too predictable.
And that predictability, that reliance on the same old tropes, it can make even the goriest scenes feel well, kind of boring.
And that's the last thing you want from a horror movie.
Exactly. And that's why I think this discussion about the gore, it's about more than just being grossed out. It's about what makes horror truly effective.
And maybe, just maybe, it's time for the Wrong Turn franchise to take a step back, reassess.
And find a new path, a new way to scare us, because the woods are full of possibilities, right?
So where does that leave Wrong Turn? I mean, we've talked about the good, the bad, the really, really gruesome.
It's a mixed bag, right? You've got those iconic villains, that whole backwoods, isolated vibe that really gets under your skin.
Totally. And the early films, they really tapped into something primal, that fear of the unknown.
But then, as the franchise went on, it's like they got stuck in a rut. More gore, crazier kills, but less of that genuine terror.
And the articles we read, they definitely picked up on that this idea that Wrong Turn might be a case of a franchise, almost trapped by its own success.
It's like they found a formula that worked, but then were too afraid to deviate from it, even when it started to feel stale.
Which makes you wonder, could they have done it differently? Could Wrong Turn have broken free from those slasher tropes and become something more?
Well, some of the articles argue that there's potential there, even suggesting that Wrong Turn could be ripe for a reinvention.
Okay, now you've got my attention. What would that even look like? A Wrong Turn movie that's actually good.
Imagine this. You keep that creepy setting, the isolation of the woods, the fear of being hunted, but with characters you actually care about?
And a story that keeps you guessing, instead of just throwing gore at the screen every 5 minutes.
Exactly. Building that slow burn tension, that sense of dread. That's what makes horror really effective. And Wrong Turn, with a fresh perspective, it could totally do that.
You've got me thinking now. A Wrong Turn movie that actually gets under your skin, instead of just making you cover your eyes. I'd watch that.
See? The possibilities are endless when you're willing to take a chance to find new ways to explore those primal fears.
Well, that's a thought-provoking note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today, from those creepy backwoods to some seriously messed up scenes.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Horror, it's a genre that keeps evolving, finding new ways to tap into our deepest fears.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? So for everyone listening, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the twisted world of Wrong Turn.
Keep those questions coming. Keep exploring those dark corners of cinema.
And until next time, stay curious.